In this lesson, we'll talk about using the pose tools in Mudbox. So let's go ahead and open up Mudbox, and we'll jump down to the pose tools tray, and you'll see that we have 4 different tools here that we can use. Now, posing can be used for what you would normally think posing a character. You could also be used to just kind of scale and move around different pieces of your model. Let's look at how posing works here. And so the first thing we'll take a look at is the Create Joint brush here. We can choose, you can see a couple of properties over here. We can choose to create one joint at a time or be able to have multiple joints created. In that case, we would be able to create our own hierarchy. We've got mirroring that we can use, and then placement. We can either have our joints placed when we click at the center of our object, like inside the geometry, or we can have them on the surface. And then the weighting, we can change from automatic to click and paint, where we can just go ahead and manually paint, or based on the topology, or none. We'll just set that to automatic. So a couple of things are going to happen here, and let's first, I'm going to take the geometry down a couple of subdivision levels. We work with it a little bit easier. And so as I click and drag, a couple of things are going to happen. Let's take a look at those. So I'll click and drag to the left, and you can see this sort of green line going up and down. That's actually a ring around the tail, and so that's our joint boundary ring. That's kind of the boundary of where that joint is going to be. Okay, and then the line that I'm dragging from right to left is the weights vector, and that's giving us an indication of how soft or how sharp that transition fall off is going to be for the weighting. So if we want something like a very sharp transition, we can do a short vector. Otherwise, we can do a longer vector. So I'll go ahead and release, and that's going to create this green weighted area. Okay, and you can see it has kind of a fall off into areas where there's no weight, and the joint is actually centered inside of the tail. So now if we want to actually start to pose that, we would jump over to our pose tool, and there are several options here for us. We can left click on the weighted area to rotate it, and that's going to be based on the screen angle. So if I rotate my camera up here and do the same thing, it's going to be based on the angle of the camera. Okay, so I can rotate it, and it's rotating around that particular point. Okay, we can come in if we wanted to move that point. We could grab the joint and still move it around. So we could move it maybe up here a little bit, go back to pose, and we're rotating around that joint. So we're still in a sort of uncommitted state with our pose. We can change weighting, come in here with our weighting. If we just paint through, you can see that I can add weighting. I can also hold control to take away weighting. Alright, so going back to pose, left clicking here, we can rotate based on the camera angle. If we click actually on the joint, we're using an axis that goes through the actual joint, going up and down and going sideways. So if I click on the joint and drag up and down, I'm twisting it around that horizontal axis. If I go sideways, I'm twisting it around that vertical axis based on the joint. Okay, we can also use our middle mouse. If we use our middle mouse button, out here we can actually move this weighted area around. So this is good for repositioning limbs and different parts of our model that we have weighted. We can go ahead and just move those. Okay, middle mouse dragging on the actual joint will scale. So I can scale that tail out. If I hold down shift, it'll do a uniform scale. So this is nice if your legs or whatever limbs that you're working with are too small or too big. You can go in and rescale those. Alright, so if we'd like to start to add multiple joints in here, we can go back to Create Joint, and we have this one joint at a time turned off. Alright, so I'm going to come in here and start to place some more joints coming along the tail. Now you can see, because this joint falls within the influence of this joint, it's created this connection, and I can go ahead and continue down to create this skeleton coming down the tail. Okay. Now going into pose, all I have to do is come in here and start to select these, and I can really quickly weight these, and it becomes pose these, and it becomes a very quick process to be able to do that. Okay. Now one thing to keep in mind with the weights vector, so now I'm committing that pose, with the weights vector and the joint boundary ring, if we were to come in here, for instance, on the leg, let's say, and we wanted to weight this, maybe we put a joint in here. If I pull the weights vector down towards the end of the leg, which may seem logical to do, you can see that actually the boundary ring isn't doing what we want. So in some cases like these, you may need to actually pull this out from the side. So in that case, we get weighting like that, and we could come in and modify this. But you can see where our weights vector wasn't actually pulled down the length of the leg. So that's just something to be aware of. All right, so we can create hierarchies like that. We can also come in and pose multiple objects. So if we use create joint and come in here, commit that pose, and we'll come into the head here, and let's just go ahead and pull this out, maybe something like that. You can see that if I pose this head, the teeth don't follow. So what I want to do is come in with the weights, and I want to actually start to add weight to the teeth so that they're actually going to be able to come with us. And so I can come in here and paint. You can see with the weights, we've got our properties over here. We can also come in and, let me undo that. Flood objects. We can come in here and paint our weight on here. And just by flooding it, I can fill that whole thing. So now the teeth will come along when I do the pose. So go back to pose, move this, and now I can move that head with the teeth. I can move it over if I want, and the teeth are following along. Okay, come back and create joint. Let's commit that pose. All right, and so if you have your mirroring on too, you can come in and start to add joints on both sides. So maybe coming in here along the arm and adding joints in there, maybe bringing one down here. And so you can see how we can really start to create our own skeleton that we can come in and manipulate. Okay, and then we could come in and pose these different joints that we've created. Now we also have some other things to talk about here with posing. We can actually import skeletons and weighting and everything using an FBX. And so let me go ahead and let's just turn all this stuff off. You can see the skeleton located here in our object list. So let me go to File, and let's go to Import. And I want to import this Rex Rig New FBX, and we'll open that up. And so this is a mesh that's actually rigged in Maya. And so we've got the skeleton that was created in Maya. We've got also weighting. So if I just go to pose and I start to grab these, you can see that the weighting is already there. Okay. So let's take a look using the skeleton at something, and this is going to be our pose preset. So under Window, we can open up, under Windows, we can open up Poses. Okay, we also have under, if we select the skeleton, we have this located under here if we want to use that. But what we can do is save poses. So in this case, we can go ahead and save pose. It says there's no poses currently saved. We'll save new pose as default. We'll save that. And now what we can do is create a new pose. So let's say we want to move his leg in here. Okay, shift the weight. If you hold down Control, you can actually rotate everything but the weighted area. So in this case, we could hold down Control and move the entire body. We'll maybe take this, move it down a little bit. Let's lift his head up a bit. Maybe lift one of his arms up. Rotate his tail a bit. Okay. And then when we're ready, maybe rotate this over. When we're ready, we can actually save this new pose, and we'll call this just pose 1. We'll save that. And now we can go back and forth between our poses. So we can see, we can say go to pose 1 or go to default. So I can go to default, I can go to pose 1. I can add a new pose in here, maybe put his head down a little bit. Okay. Maybe bend his tail down a little. Okay, something like that. Save new pose as, let's save it as pose 2. And now we can cycle through these different poses. So we can have a variety of poses that we can just quickly jump through. Okay. And we were able to rig, set the bones up and do the weighting in Maya and just import it as an FBX. And Mudbox recognizes those joints there. You can see under our skeleton all of those joints listed. Okay, so that's a look at posing and some of the new features that have to do with posing, our pose presets and so forth. So make sure to check that out when you're working with your meshes, not just for characters, but also for objects that you just want to kind of move some pieces of it around, maybe scale it. Posing, the pose tools can really be useful for that. All right, so the next thing that we want to look at, and the final thing that we want to look at, is how Mudbox integrates with some of the other 3D applications that we may be using. So thinking about 3ds Max, Softimage, and Maya, the fact that Mudbox can create a really close connection with those and be able to really streamline our workflow. So we'll take a look at that in the next lesson.